Chapter 26 of Mountain Adventures in the Various Countries of the World. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. Mountain Adventures in the Various Countries of the World by John TIMBS. Chapter 26. The Silla of Caracas. A. de Humboldt. I remained 2 months at Caracas, where Monsieur Bonpland and I lived in a large house in the most elevated part of the town. From a gallery we could survey at once the summit of the Silla, the serrated edge of the Galipano, and the charming valley of the Guayara, the rich culture of which was pleasingly contrasted with the gloomy curtain of the surrounding mountains. It was in the dry season, and to improve the pasturage, the savannas and the turf covering the steepest rocks were set on fire. These vast conflagrations, viewed from a distance, produce the most singular effects of light. Wherever the savannas, following the undulating slope of the rocks, have filled up the furrows hollowed out by the water, the flame appears on a dark night like currents of lava, suspended over the valley. The vivid but steady light assumes a reddish tint, when the wind, descending from the Silla, accumulates streams of vapor in the low regions. At other times, and this effect is still more curious, these luminous bands, enveloped in thick clouds, appear only at intervals when it is clear, and as the clouds ascend their edges reflect a splendid light. These various phenomena, so common in the tropics, acquire additional interest from the form of the mountains, the direction of the slopes, and the height of the savannas covered with alpine grasses. During the day the wind of Bekere, blowing from the east, drives the smoke towards the town and diminishes the transparency of the air. In a country abounding in such magnificent scenery, and at a period when, notwithstanding some symptoms of popular commotion, most of the inhabitants seem only to direct their attention to physical objects, such as the fertility of the year, the long drought, or the conflicting winds of Bekere and Katia, I expected to find many individuals well acquainted with the lofty surrounding mountains, but I was disappointed, and we could not find in Caracas a single individual who had visited the summit of the Silla. Hunters do not ascend so high on the ridges of mountains, and in these countries journeys are not undertaken for such purposes as gathering alpine plants, carrying a barometer to an elevated point, or examining the nature of rocks. Accustomed to a uniform and domestic life, the people dread fatigue and sudden changes of climate. They seem to live not only to enjoy life, but only to prolong it. Our walks led us often in the direction of 2 coffee plantations, the proprietors of which, Don Andres de Ibarra and Monsieur Blandin, were men of agreeable manners. These plantations were situated opposite the Silla de Caracas. Surveying, by a telescope, the steep declivity of the mountain, and the form of the 2 peaks by which it is terminated, we could form an idea of the difficulties we should have to encounter on reaching its summit. Angles of elevation, taken with the sextant at our house, had led me to believe that the summit was not so high above sea level as the great square of Quito. This estimate was far from corresponding with the notions entertained by the inhabitants of the city. Mountains which command great towns have acquired, from that very circumstance, an extraordinary celebrity in both continents. Long before they have been accurately measured, a conventional height is assigned to them, and to entertain the least doubt respecting that height is to wound national prejudice. The Captain General, Señor de Guevara, directed the Teniente of Chacao to furnish us with guides to conduct us on our ascent of the Silla. These guides were negroes, and they knew something of the path leading over the ridge of the mountain, near the western peak of the Silla. This path is frequented by smugglers, but neither the guides nor the most experienced of the militia, accustomed to pursue the smugglers in these wild spots, had been on the eastern peak forming the most elevated summit of the Silla. During the whole month of December the mountain, of which the angles of elevation made me acquainted with the effects of the terrestrial refraction, had appeared only 5 times free of clouds. In this season of the year 2 serene days seldom succeed each other, and we were therefore advised not to choose a clear day for our excursion, but rather a time when, the clouds not being elevated, we might hope, after having crossed the first layer of vapours uniformly spread, to enter into dry and transparent air. We passed the night on the 2nd of January in the Estancia de Gallegos, a plantation of coffee trees, near which the little river of Chacaito, flowing in a luxuriantly shaded ravine, forms some fine cascades in descending the mountains. The night was pretty clear, and though on the day preceding a fatiguing journey it might have been well to have enjoyed some repose, Monsieur Bonpland and I passed the whole night in watching 3 occultations of the satellites of Jupiter. I had previously determined the instant of the observations, but we missed them all, owing to some error of calculation in the connaissance des temps. The apparent time had been mistaken for mean time. I was much disappointed by this accident, and after having observed at the foot of the mountains the intensity of the magnetic forces before sunrise, we set out at 5 in the morning, accompanied by slaves carrying our instruments. Our party consisted of 18 persons, and we all walked one behind another in a narrow path traced on a steep declivity covered with turf. We endeavoured first to reach a hill, which towards the southeast seems to form a promontory of the Silla. It is connected with the body of the mountain by a narrow dike, called by the shepherds the Gate or Puerta de la Silla. We reached this dike about 7. The morning was fine and cool, and the sky then seemed to favour our excursion. I saw that the temperature kept a little below 57 degrees. The barometer showed that we were already 685 fathoms above the level of the sea, that is, nearly 80 fathoms higher than at the Venta, where we enjoyed so magnificent a view of the coast. Our guides thought that it would require 6 hours more to reach the summit of the Silla. We crossed a narrow dike of rocks, covered with turf, which led us from the promontory of the Puerta to the ridge of the great mountain. Here the eye looks down on 2 valleys, or rather narrow defiles, filled with thick vegetation. On the right is perceived the ravine which descends between the 2 peaks to the farm of Munoz. On the left we saw the defile of Chacaito, with its waters flowing out near the farm of Gallegos. The roaring of the cascades is heard, while the water is unseen, being concealed by thick groves of erythrina, clusia, and the Indian fig tree. Nothing can be more picturesque in a climate where so many plants have broad, large, shining, and coriaceous leaves, than the aspect of trees when the spectator looks down from a great height above them, and when they are illumined by the almost perpendicular rays of the sun. From the Puerta de la Silla the steepness of the ascent increases, and we were obliged to incline our bodies considerably forward as we advanced. The slope is often from 30 to 32 degrees. We felt the want of cramp irons, or sticks shod with iron. Short grass covered the rocks of gneiss, and it was equally impossible to hold by the grass, or to form steps, as we might have done in softer ground. This ascent, which was attended with more fatigue than danger, discouraged those who accompanied us from the town, and who were more unaccustomed to climb mountains. We lost a great deal of time in waiting for them, and we did not resolve to proceed alone till we saw them descending the mountain instead of climbing up it. The weather was becoming cloudy, the mist already issued in the form of smoke, and in slender and perpendicular streaks, from a small, luminous wood which bordered the region of alpine savannas. It seemed as if a fire had burst forth at once on several points of the forest. These streaks of vapour gradually accumulated together, and rising above the ground, were carried along by the morning breeze, and glided like a light cloud over the rounded summit of the mountain. Monsieur Bonpland and I foresaw from these infallible signs that we should soon be covered by a thick fog, and lest our guides should take advantage of this circumstance, We obliged those who carried the most necessary instruments to precede us. We continued climbing the slopes which led towards the ravine of Chacaito. The eastern peak is the most elevated of the two which form the summit of the mountain, and to this we directed our course with our instruments. The hollow between the two peaks has suggested the Spanish name of Silla, saddle, which is given to the whole mountain. We were sometimes so enveloped in mist that we could with difficulty find our way. At this height there is no path, and we were obliged to climb with our hands when our feet failed us on the steep and slippery declivity. After proceeding for the space of 4 hours across the savannas, we entered a little wood composed of shrubs and small trees, called El Pejual. We spent a long time in examining the fine resinous and fragrant plants of the Pejual. Quitting the little thicket of alpine plants, we found ourselves again in a savanna. We climbed over a part of the western dome, in order to descend into the hollow of the Silla, a valley which separates the two summits of the mountain. We there had great difficulties to overcome occasionally by the force of the vegetation. Wandering in this thick wood of musaceae, or arborescent plants, we constantly directed our course towards the eastern peak, which we perceived from time to time through an opening. On a sudden we found ourselves again enveloped in a dense mist. The compass alone could guide us, but in advancing northward we were in danger at every step of finding ourselves on the brink of that enormous wall of rocks which descends almost perpendicularly to the depth of 6,000 feet towards the sea. We were obliged to halt. Surrounded by clouds sweeping the ground, we began to doubt whether we should reach the eastern peak before night. Happily, the negroes who carried our water and provisions soon reached us, and we resolved to take some refreshment. We were 3/4 of an hour in reaching the summit of the pyramid. Having arrived there, we enjoyed for a few minutes only the serenity of the sky. We were at 1,350 fathoms of elevation. We gazed on an extent of sea, the radius of which was 36 leagues. It was 4:30 when we finished our observations. Satisfied with the success of our journey, we forgot that there might be danger in descending in the dark steep declivities covered by a smooth and slippery turf. The mist concealed the valley from us, but we distinguished the double hill of La Puerta, which, like all objects lying almost perpendicularly beneath our eye, appeared extremely near. We relinquished our design of passing the night between the two summits of the Silla, and having again found the path we had cut through the thick wood of the heliconia, we soon arrived at Pejual, the region of odoriferous and resinous plants. As there is scarcely any twilight in the tropics, we passed suddenly from bright daylight to darkness. The moon was on the horizon, but her disk was veiled from time to time by thick clouds, drifted by a cold and rough wind. Rapid slopes, covered with yellow and dry grass, now seen in shade and now suddenly illumined, seemed like precipices, the depth of which the eye sought in vain to measure. We proceeded onwards in single file, and endeavoured to support ourselves by our hands, lest we should roll down. The guides who carried our instruments abandoned us successively to sleep on the mountain. Among those who remained with us was a Congo black, who evinced great address, bearing on his head a large dipping needle. He held it constantly steady, notwithstanding the extreme declivity of the rocks. The fog had dispersed by degrees in the bottom of the valley, and the scattered lights we perceived below us caused a double illusion. The steeps appeared still more dangerous than they really were, and during 6 hours of continued descent we seemed to be always equally near the farms at the foot of the Silla. We heard very distinctly the voices of men and the notes of guitars. Sound is generally so well propagated upwards, that in a balloon at the elevation of 18,000 feet the barking of dogs is sometimes heard. We did not arrive till 10 at night at the bottom of the valley. A. de Humboldt, Voyages aux Regiones Equinoxiales du Nouveau Continent. End of chapter 26.
Chapter 27 of Mountain Adventures in the Various Countries of the World. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. Recording by Myra Parker. Mountain Adventures in the Various Countries of the World by John TIMBS. Chapter 27. Chimborazo. Riobamba is perhaps the most singular diorama in the world. The town presents nothing remarkable in itself, but it is placed on one of the sterile plateaux so common in the Andes, which, at this great elevation, have all of them a characteristic appearance of winter, which impresses the traveler with a feeling of sadness. In order to reach it, he has to pass through very picturesque places, and this increases the depression produced by the change, for it is always with regret that one leaves the climate of the tropics for the frosts of the north. From the house where I lived, I could look over Capacurco, Tunguragua, Cubille, Carguairazo, and lastly, to the north, Chimborazo. Besides, several other celebrated mountains of the Paramos, which, though they have not the honor of perpetual snow, are still, nonetheless, worthy of the attention of the geologist. This vast amphitheater, which bounds on all sides the horizon of Riobamba, is the scene of continually varied phenomena. It is curious to observe the different appearances of these glaciers at different hours of the day, and to see their apparent heights varying from one moment to another, from the effect of atmospheric refractions, and it is with great interest that one sees produced in a space so circumscribed all the great phenomena of meteorology. Here it is one of those clouds that de Saussure has so well described as parasitical clouds, which has just attached itself to the middle part of a cone of trachyte. It sticks to it, and the wind, though blowing strongly, cannot move it. Soon the thunder bursts from this mass of vapor. Hail, mingled with rain, inundates the lower part of the mountain, whilst its snowy summit, which the storm has not yet reached, is vividly lighted up by the sun. Further on, it is a sharp peak of ice resplendent with light. It stands out against the azure of the heavens, and all its forms may be distinguished even to the minutiae. The atmosphere is remarkably clear, and yet this peak is covered with a cloud which seems to emanate from its own bosom, so that one might imagine it to have come out of smoke. This cloud is already become a light vapor, and soon it disappears altogether. But soon also it reproduces itself, just to disappear again. This intermittent formation of the clouds is a very frequent phenomenon on the summits of mountains covered with snow. It is chiefly observable in serene weather, always some hours after the culmination of the sun. In these conditions the glaciers may be compared to condensers thrust up towards the high regions of the atmosphere, in order to dry up the water by freezing it, and to bring back in this way to the surface of the earth the water which they find in a state of vapor. These plateaus, surrounded by glaciers, sometimes present the most lugubrious aspect when a continued wind brings to them the humid air of the hot regions. The mountains become invisible, and the horizon is masked by a line of clouds which seem to touch the earth. The day is cold and damp, this mass of vapor being almost impenetrable to the solar light. It is a long twilight, the only one which is known in the tropics, for in the equatorial zone the night succeeds suddenly to day, so that the sun seems to become extinguished in setting. I could not better finish my researches on the trachytes of the Cordilleras than by a special study of Chimborazo. In order to do so, it was certainly sufficient to approach its base. But what made me go beyond the snowy boundary, what made me determine on the ascent, was the hope of obtaining the mean temperature of an extremely elevated station. and although this hope was frustrated, my excursion, I hope, was not without its use with regard to science. My friend Colonel Hall, who had already accompanied me up Antisana and Cotopaxi, wished again to go with me on this expedition, in order to add to the knowledge which he had already possessed of the topography of Quito, and to continue his researches on the geography of plants. From Riobamba, Chimborazo presents two slopes of very different inclinations. The one which looks towards the Arenal is very abrupt, and there are to be seen coming out from under the ice numerous points of trachyte. The other, towards the place called Chiapuyu, not far from Mocha, is, on the contrary, little inclined, but of a considerable extent. After having well examined the environs of the mountains, it was by this slope that we resolved to attack it. On the 14th of December, 1831, we went to lodge at the farm of the Chimborazo, where we found dry straw to lie on, and some sheepskins to keep us from the cold. The farm stands on an elevation of 12,350, so that the nights are cool there, and as a resting place it is not agreeable, because wood is scarce. We were already in the region of gramineous plants, which has to be crossed before the region of perpetual snow is reached. There all ligneous vegetation ends. On the 15th, at 7 in the morning, we put ourselves en route, guided by an Indian from the farm. We followed, in ascending, a rivulet enclosed between two walls of trachyte, whose waters descend from the glacier. But very soon we quitted this crevasse in order to direct our steps towards Mocha, going along the base of Chimborazo. We rose insensibly, and our mules walked with trouble and difficulty through the debris of rock which has accumulated on the foot of the mountain. The slope then became very rapid. The ground was unstable, and the mules stopped almost at every step to make a long pause. They no longer obeyed the spur. The breathing of the animals was hurried and panting. We were then precisely at the height of Mont Blanc, for the barometer indicated an elevation of 15,626 feet above the level of the sea. After we had covered our faces with masks of light gauze, in order to preserve ourselves from accidents such as we had met with on the Antisana, we began to ascend a ridge which abutted on a very elevated point of the glacier. It was midday. We went up slowly, and as we got further and further on to the snow, the difficulty of breathing and walking became more and more felt. But we easily regained our strength by stopping at every 8 or 10 steps without always sitting down. As we went on, we felt extreme fatigue from the want of consistency in a snowy soil, which continually gave way under our feet, and in which we sank sometimes up to the waist. In spite of all our efforts, we were soon convinced of the impossibility of advancing. In fact, a little farther on, the shifting snow was more than 4 feet deep. We went to rest on a block of trachyte, which resembled an island in the midst of a sea of snow. The height noted down was 16,623 feet, so that, after much fatigue, we had only reached 997 feet higher than the place where we set out. At 6 o'clock we were back at the farm. The weather had been splendid, and Chimborazo had never appeared to us so magnificent. But after our fruitless journey, we could not help looking at it with a feeling of spite. We were determined to attempt the ascent by the abrupt side, that is to say, by the slope which looks towards the Arenal. We knew that it was on this side that Humboldt had ascended this mountain, for they had pointed out to us at Riobamba the point to which he had reached, but it was impossible for us to obtain exact information as to the route which he had followed to get there, for the Indians who had accompanied that intrepid traveler were no longer living. At 7 o'clock the next day, we took the road towards the Arenal. The sky was remarkably pure. On the east we perceived the famous volcano of Sangay. in the province of Macas, which nearly a century before La Condamine had seen in a state of permanent incandescence. In proportion as we advanced, the land rose sensibly. In general, the trachyte plateau, which supports the isolated peaks with which the Andes are, as it were, bristling, rise gradually to the base of these same peaks. The numerous and deep crevasses which furrow these plateaux seem all to start from a common center. They become narrower as they get away from this center. We could only compare them to the lines on the surface of a cracked glass. We were at a height of 16,071 feet when we took to journeying on foot. The ground had become altogether impracticable for the mules, and besides, those animals, whose instinct is extraordinary, tried to make us understand the great fatigue which they felt. Their ears, usually so straight and attentive, were quite drooping, and during the frequent halts which they made for breath, they never ceased looking towards the plain. Few riders have probably taken their steeds to such a height, and to travel on the backs of mules over a moving soil beyond the limits of the snow requires, perhaps, several years' experience in riding in the Andes. After having examined the locality in which we were, we saw that in order to gain a ridge which ascended towards the summit of Chimborazo, we must first climb an excessively steep ascent just in front of us. It was formed in great part of blocks of rock of all sizes, disposed in slopes. Here and there these fragments of trachyte were covered by sheets of ice more or less extensive, and in several points you could clearly see that these debris of rock lay over the hardened snow. They proceeded consequently from the recent falls which had taken place in the upper part of the mountain. These falls are frequent, and in the midst of the glaciers of the Cordilleras, what one has most to fear are the avalanches in which there are really more stones than snow. At 11 o'clock we finished crossing a very extended sheet of ice, on which we had been obliged to cut notches in order to make sure of our steps. This passage was not without danger, for a slide might have cost us our lives. We entered then afresh on the debris of trachyte, which was firm earth to us, and from that time we were able to ascend more rapidly. We marched along in a file, I first, then Colonel Hall, and my negro last. He followed my steps exactly, in order not to endanger the safety of the instruments which were entrusted to him. We kept an absolute silence during our march. Experience having taught me that nothing exhausts so much as a sustained conversation at this height. And during our halts, if we exchanged a few words, it was in a low voice. It is in a great measure to this precaution that I attribute the state of health which I have constantly enjoyed during my ascents up volcanoes. And this precaution I imposed, so to speak, in a despotic manner on those who accompanied me. For on the Antisana, an Indian who neglected it and called with all the strength of his lungs to Colonel Hall, who had lost his way as we were passing through a cloud, was attacked with giddiness and hemorrhage. We had now reached the ridge at which we were aiming. It was not what we had thought it from a distance, for in fact there was little snow on it. But then its sides were so steep that they were very difficult to climb. We were obliged to make almost unheard of efforts, and such gymnastics were painful in these aerial regions. At last we arrived at the foot of a perpendicular wall of trachyte, which was many hundred feet in height. There was a visible feeling of discouragement in the expedition when the barometer told us that we were only at a height of 18,460 feet. This was little for us, for it was not even the height to which we had attained on Cotopaxi. Besides, Humboldt had ascended higher on Chimborazo, and we wished at least to attain the point at which that learned traveler had stopped. Explorers of mountains, when they are discouraged, are always very much disposed to sit down, And that is what we did on the Peña Colorada red rock. It was the first rest sitting that we had allowed ourselves, and as we were all excessively thirsty, our first occupation was to suck some icicles in order to quench this thirst. It was 1:45 p.m., and yet we felt quite cold enough, and the thermometer was down to 31 degrees. We then found ourselves enveloped in a cloud. When this had disappeared, we examined our situation, looking towards the red rock. We had, on the right, a frightful abyss. On the left, towards the Arenal, we could distinguish an advanced rock which looked like a turret. It was important to reach this in order to see if we could turn the red rock, and to ascertain at the same time if it were possible to continue our ascent. Access to this turret was difficult, but I managed it with the assistance of my 2 companions. I saw then that if we succeeded in climbing over a very inclined surface covered with snow, which leant against one face of this red rock opposite to the side by which we had reached it, we should attain a very considerable elevation. And in order to get a clear idea of the topography of Chimborazo, let any one picture to himself an immense rock sustained on all sides by such props, which from the plain seemed to lean against this enormous block in order to shore it up. Before undertaking this dangerous passage, I ordered my Negro to go and try the snow. It was of a convenient consistency. Hall and the Negro succeeded in turning the foot of the position which I occupied, and I joined them when they were sufficiently firmly planted to receive me, for in order to rejoin them it was necessary to slide down about 25 feet of ice. At the moment of setting forward, a stone detached itself from the top of the mountain and fell quite close to Colonel Hall. He tottered and fell. I thought him wounded, and was only reassured when I saw him get up and examine with his magnifying glass the sample of rock which was so roughly submitted to our investigation. The unlucky trachyte was of the same kind as that on which we were walking. We advanced carefully. On the right we could support ourselves on the rock. On the left the declivity was frightful, and before going forward we began by familiarizing ourselves with the precipice. This is a precaution which should never be neglected in the mountains whenever a dangerous place has to be passed. De Saussure said so long ago, but it cannot be repeated too often, and in my adventurous journeys among the peaks of the Andes I have never lost sight of this wise precept. We began already to feel more than we had yet done the effect of the rarefaction of the air. We were obliged to stop every 2 or 3 steps, and often even to lie down for 2 or 3 seconds. Once seated, we were all right again. Our suffering was only during the time that we were in motion. But the snow itself soon rendered our progress as slow as it was dangerous. It was only soft for about 3 or 4 inches, and below was a very hard and slippery ice, in which we were obliged to cut notches. The Negro went before in order to make these steps, and the labor exhausted him in a moment. I went forward to relieve him and slid, but happily for me, Hall and my Negro held me up. However, for an instant we were all in imminent danger. This incident made us hesitate a moment, but taking new courage we resolved to go on. The snow became more favorable. We made a last effort, and in an hour and 3/4 we were on the desired ridge. There we were convinced that it was impossible to do more, being now at the foot of a prism of trachyte, of which the upper basis, covered with a cupola of snow, forms the summit of Chimborazo. The ridge at which we arrived was only some feet in width. On all sides we were environed with precipices, and surrounded by the strangest sights. The deep color of the rock contrasted in the most striking manner with the dazzling whiteness of the snow. Long stalagmites of ice appeared suspended over our heads, so that one might have thought that a magnificent cascade had frozen there. The weather was beautiful, some light clouds only being visible in the west. The air was quite calm, so that the view was very extensive. The situation was new, and we felt a lively satisfaction in it. We were at a height of 19,513 feet, which is, I believe, the greatest height to which men have ever climbed. After some moments' repose, we found ourselves entirely recovered from our fatigues, and neither of us experienced those uncomfortable sensations which most persons who have ascended high mountains have done. After some moments' repose, we found ourselves entirely recovered from our fatigue, and neither of us experienced those uncomfortable sensations which most persons who have ascended high mountains have done. 3/4 of an hour after our arrival, my pulse and also Colonel Hall's beat 106 in a minute. We were thirsty and evidently under a slightly feverish influence, but it was not a painful state. My friend was very gay and constantly saying the most piquant things, notwithstanding that he was occupied in drawing the view that lay beneath us. All sound seemed to me, however, thinned in a remarkable manner, and the voices of my companions were so much changed that under any other circumstances it would have been impossible to recognize them. The slight noise which the blows of my hammer on the rock made also surprised us very much. The rarefaction of the air generally produces very marked results on climbers. On the summit of Mont Blanc, de Saussure felt an uneasiness and a disposition to sickness, and his guides, who were all inhabitants of Chamonix, experienced the same sensations. This state of uneasiness increased also when he made any movement or when he fixed his attention on any observations which he was making. The first Spaniards who went over the high mountains of America were attacked, according to the account of Acosta, by nausea and stomach complaints. Bouguer had several attacks of hemorrhage in the Cordilleras of Quito. The same thing happened on Mont Rosa to M. Zumstein. And lastly, on Chimborazo, M. de Humboldt and Bonpland, at the time of their ascent of the 23rd of June, 1802, felt a disposition to vomit, and the blood came out of their lips and of their gums. As for ourselves, we had certainly found a difficulty in breathing, and an extreme lassitude as we ascended, but these inconveniences ceased with the movement. Once at rest, and we believed ourselves to be in our normal state, perhaps we must attribute our insensibility to the effects of rarefied air, to our prolonged stay in the high towns of the Andes. When one has seen the activity which there is in the towns like Bogota, Miquipampa, Potosi, etc., which are at from 8,000 to 12,000 feet above the sea, when one has been witness to the strength and prodigious agility of the toreadors in a bullfight at Quito, which is at a height of more than 9,000 feet, when one has seen, lastly, young and delicate women give themselves up to dancing during entire nights in localities almost as elevated as Mont Blanc, when the celebrated de Saussure found hardly enough strength to consult his instruments, and where his vigorous mountaineers fell exhausted whilst digging a hole in the snow, if I must add, a celebrated battle, that of Pichincha, was fought at a height differing little from that of Mont Blanc, it will be granted, I think, that man may become accustomed to breathe the rarefied air of the highest mountains. Whilst we were occupied in making our observations on Chimborazo, the weather continued fine, and the sun was so hot as slightly to incommode us. Towards 3 o'clock we perceived some clouds forming below in the plain. The thunder soon began to growl below our position, and though the noise was not loud, it was prolonged. We thought at first that it was a bramido, or subterranean rumbling. Dark clouds then gathered round the base of the mountain, and they slowly rose towards us. So we had no time to lose, for it was essential that we should pass the bad places before we were overtaken, as otherwise we should run into the greatest dangers. A heavy fall of snow or frost, which should render the way slippery, would suffice to hinder our return, and we had no provision for a stay on the glacier. The descent was difficult. After we had got down from 900 to 1200 feet, we penetrated into clouds by entering them from above. A little lower, hail began to fall, which considerably chilled the air. And at the moment at which we met the Indian who took care of our mules, the cloud broke over us in hail that was so large as to be quite painful when the hailstones struck either our heads or faces. In proportion as we descended, an icy rain was mixed with the hail. Night surprised us on the road, and it was 8 o'clock when we reached the farm. The observations which I was able to collect during this excursion tend all of them to confirm any ideas on the nature of the trachyte mountains which form the chain of the Cordilleras, for I have seen repeated on Chimborazo all the facts which I have noticed in treating of the volcanoes of the equator. It is evidently itself an extinct volcano, like Cotopaxi, Antisana, Tunguragua, and in general the mountains which stand thickly on the plateau of the Andes. The mass of Chimborazo is formed by the accumulation of trachyte debris heaped together without any order. These fragments, of a size which is often enormous, have been thrown together in a solid state. Their angles are always sharp, and nothing indicates that there has been any fusion or even a simple state of softness. Nowhere in any of the volcanoes of the equator does one observe anything which would lead one to presume that there had been a flow of lava. Nothing but muddy, elastic fluids or incandescent blocks of trachyte, more or less solid, have come out of these craters, and these have often been thrown to considerable distances. On the 23rd of December, in the afternoon, I quitted Riobamba, directing my course towards Guayaquil, where I was to embark in order to visit the coast of Peru. It was in sight of Chimborazo that I separated from Colonel Hall. During my stay in the province of Quito, I had enjoyed his confidence and his friendship. His perfect acquaintance with the localities had been of the greatest use to me, and I had found in him an excellent and indefatigable traveling companion. And lastly, both of us had served for a long time in the cause of independence. Our farewells were full of regret, and something seemed to tell us that we should never meet again. This fatal presentiment was but too well founded, for some months afterwards my unhappy friend was assassinated in a street of Quito. Bousingot, Voyage au Volcan de Ecuador. End of chapter 27. Recording by Myra Parker.
Chapter 28 of Mountain Adventures in the Various Countries of the World. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. Mountain Adventures in the Various Countries of the World by John TIMBS. Chapter 28, Discovery of Peruvian Bark. The whole world, and especially all tropical countries where intermittent fevers prevail, have long been indebted to the mountainous forests of the Andes for that inestimable febrifuge which has now become indispensable, and the demand for which is rapidly increasing, while the supply decreases throughout all civilized countries. There is probably no drug which is more valuable to man than the febrifugal alkaloid which is extracted from the chinchona trees of South America, and few greater blessings could be conferred on the human race than the naturalization of these trees in India and other congenial regions, so as to render the supply more certain, cheaper, and more abundant. It would be strange indeed if, as is generally supposed, the Indian or aborigines of South America were ignorant of the virtues of Peruvian bark. Yet the absence of this sovereign remedy in the wallets of itinerant native doctors who have plied their trade from father to son since the time of the Incas certainly gives some countenance to this idea. It seems probable, nevertheless, that the Indians were aware of the virtues of Peruvian bark in the neighborhood of Loxa, 230 miles south of Quito, where its use was first made known to Europeans, and the Indian name for the tree, quina, bark of bark, indicates that it was believed to possess some special medicinal properties. The Indians looked upon their conquerors with dislike and suspicion. It is improbable that they would be quick to impart knowledge of this nature to them, and the interval which elapsed between the discovery and settlement of the country and the first use of Peruvian bark by Europeans may thus easily be explained. It may be added, however, that though the Indians were aware of the febrifugal qualities of this bark, they attached little importance to them. They think that the cold north alone permits the use of fever bark, consider it very heating, and therefore an unfit remedy in complaints which they believe to arise from inflammation of the blood. In about 1630, Don Juan Lopez de Canizares, the Spanish corregidor of Loxa, being ill of an intermittent fever, an Indian of Malacotas is said to have revealed to him the healing virtues of quina bark, and to have instructed him in the proper way to administer it, and thus his cure was effected. In 1638, the wife of Luis Geronimo Fernandez de Cabrera Bobadilla y Mendoza, 4th Count of Chincona, lay sick of an intermittent fever in the palace at Lima. Her famous cure induced Linnaeus, long afterwards, to name the whole genus of quinine-bearing trees in her honor, Chincona. The Count of Chincona returned to Spain in 1640, and his countess, bringing with her a quantity of the healing bark, was the first person to introduce this invaluable medicine into Europe. After the cure of the Countess of Chincona, the Jesuits were the greatest promoters of the introduction of the bark into Europe. In 1670s, the Jesuit missionaries sent parcels of the powdered bark to Rome, whence it was distributed to members of the fraternity throughout Europe by the Cardinal de Lugo, and used for the cure of agues with great success. Hence the name of Jesuit bark and Cardinal's bark, and it was a ludicrous result of its patronage by the Jesuits that its use should have been for a long time opposed by Protestants and favored by Roman Catholics. In 1679, Louis XIV bought the secret of preparing quina from Sir Robert Taylor, an English doctor, for 2,000 louis d'or, a large pension and a title. From that time, Peruvian bark seems to have been recognized as the most efficacious remedy for intermittent fevers. The region of Chincona trees extends from 19 degrees south latitude to 10 degrees north, following the almost semicircular curve of the Cordillera of the Andes on 1,740 miles of latitude. They flourish in a cool and equable temperature on the slopes, and in the valleys and ravines of the mountains, and surrounded by the most majestic scenery, never descending below an elevation of 2,500, and ascending as high as 9,000 feet above the sea. Within these limits, their usual companions are tree ferns, Melostomaceae, arborescent passion flowers, and allied genera of sinocoseous plants. Below them are the forests, abounding in palms and bamboos. Above their highest limits are a few lonely alpine shrubs. But within this wide zone grow many species of chincona, and within its own narrower belts as regards elevation above the sea, some yielding the inestimable bark, and others commercially worthless. The chincona plant has never been found in any part of the world beyond the limits already described. When in good soil and under favorable circumstances, they become large forest trees, on higher elevation, and when crowded and growing in rocky ground, they frequently run up to great heights without a branch, and at the upper limit of their zone, they become mere shrubs. The leaves are of a great variety of shapes and sizes, but in most of the finest species they are lanceolate, with a shining surface of bright green, traversed by crimson veins, and petioles of the same color. The flowers are very small, but hang in clustering panicles, like lilacs, generally of a deep rosette color, paler near the stalk, dark crimson within the tube, with white curly hairs bordering the lacenae of the corolla. The flowers of C. Mancranthia are entirely white. They send forth a delicious fragrance which scents the air in their vicinity. The roots, flowers, and capsules of the chincona trees have a bitter taste, with tonic properties, but the upper bark is the only part which has any commercial value. Until the present century, Peruvian bark was used in its crude state, and numerous attempts were made at different times to discover the actual healing principle in the bark before success was finally attained. The first trial which is worthy of attention was made in 1779 by the chemists Bugeaud and Cornet, who recognized the existence of an essential salt, a resinous and unearthly matter in quinquina bark. In 1790 Fourcroy discovered the existence of a coloring matter, afterwards called chincona red, and a Swedish doctor named Westrig in 1800 believed that he had discovered the active principle in quinquina bark. Rose, a Russian chemist in 1815, was the first to give a tolerable analysis of it, and about the same time Dr. Duncan of Edinburgh suggested that a real substance existed as a feverfrugal principle. Dr. Gomez, a surgeon in the Portuguese Navy, in 1816 was the first to isolate this principle, and he called it quinquonine. But the final discovery of quinine is due to the French chemists Pelletier and Caventou in 1820. They considered that a vegetable alkaloid, analogous to morphine and strychnine, existed in quinaquina bark, and they afterwards discovered that the feverfrugal principle was seated in two alkaloids, separate or together, in the different kinds of bark, called quinine and chinchonine, with the same virtues, which, however, were much more powerful in quinine. The discovery of these alkaloids in the quinine bark, by enabling chemists to extract the healing principle, has greatly increased the usefulness of the drug. In small doses, they promote the appetite and assist digestion, and quinquonine is equal to quinine in mild cases of intermittent fever. But in severe cases, the use of quinine is absolutely necessary. India and other countries have been vainly searched for a substitute for quinine, and we may say with as much truth now as Lambert did in 1820, this medicine, the most precious of all those known in the art of healing, is one of the greatest conquests made by man over the vegetable kingdom. The treasures which Peru yields, and which the Spaniards sought and dug out of the bowels of the earth, are not to be compared for utility with the bark of the quinaquina tree, which they for a long time ignored. The species yielding red bark, the richest and most important of all the quinquonae, is found in the forests on the western slopes of Mount Chimborazo, along the banks of the rivers Chancon, Chasausen, San Antonio, and their tributaries. The collection of bark in the South American forests was conducted from the first with the most reckless extravagance. No attempt worthy the name has ever been made either with a view to the conservation or cultivation of the chinchona trees, and both the complete abandonment of the forests to the mercy of every speculator, as in Peru, Ecuador, and New Granada, and the barbarous meddling legislation of Bolivia, have led to the equally destructive results. The bark collector enters the forest and destroys the first clump of trees he finds, without a thought of any measure to preserve the continuance of a supply of bark. Thus in Apolomomba, where the trees once grew thickly round the village, no fully grown one is now to be found within 8 or 10 days' journey, and so utterly improvident are the collectors that, in the forest of Cochabamba, they bark the tree without felling, and thus ensure its death. Or, if they cut it down, they actually neglect to take off the bark on the side touching the ground, to save themselves the trouble of turning the trunk over. In 1839, Dr. Boyle recommended the introduction of the chinchona trees into India, pointing out the Nilgiri and Sylhet hills as suitable sites for the experiment, and Lord William Bentinck took some interest in the project. But this attempt was surrounded by difficulties, from which all other undertakings of a similar nature had been free. When tea was introduced into the Himalayan districts, it had been a cultivated plant in China for many ages, and experienced Chinese cultivators came with it. But the chinchona had never been cultivated since the discovery of its value in 1638. It had remained a wild forest tree. All information concerning it was solely derived from the observations of European travelers who had penetrated into the virgin forests, and the only guidance for cultivators in India is to be found in the report of these travelers, and in the experience slowly acquired by careful and intelligent trials. Great as these difficulties were, they were probably exceeded by the perils and risks of every description which must be encountered in collecting plants and seeds in South America and conveying them to India. But the vast importance of the introduction of these plants into our Indian Empire, and the inestimable benefits which would thus be conferred on the millions who inhabit the fever-haunted plains and jungles, were commensurate with the difficulties of the undertaking. In 1859, my services were accepted to superintend the collection of chinchona plants and seeds in South America, and their introduction into India. I was authorized by Lord Stanley, then Secretary of State for India, to make such arrangements as should best ensure the complete success of an enterprise, the results of which were expected to add materially to the resources of our Indian Empire. By the spring of 1861, a large supply of plants and young seedlings was established in the Nilgiri Hills, and at the present moment we have thousands of chinchona plants of all the valuable species flourishing and multiplying rapidly in southern India and in Ceylon. Extracts from Travels in Peru and India by Clement R. Markham, FSA, FRGS. End of Chapter 28. Recording by Todd.
Chapter 29 of Mountain Adventures in the Various Countries of the World. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. Recording by BettyB. Mountain Adventures in the Various Countries of the World by John TIMBS. Animal Life in Mountain Regions. The jackdaw, the lagopus, insects of the high regions. Birds naturally represent the population of the highest altitudes. In the Andes, the condor, in the Alps, the eagle, and the vulture hover above the most gigantic peaks. These creatures, being organized for long voyages, are the great sailors of the atmospheric ocean, just as the terns and the petrels are the great sailors of the Atlantic. The jackdaw, that species of very black crow, which has a yellow beak and bright red claws, does not attain to so great a height in the air, but it is, par excellence, the bird of high peaks, of the regions of snows and of sterile summits. We find it on the top of Monte Rosa and of the Col du Géant, 11,373 feet above the sea. Collected in flocks in the windings and turnings of the mountain, and skimming over the steepest rocks, the jackdaw utters his noisy note. Just those places which are particularly steep and precipitous, and which make us giddy, have a particular attraction for birds. Gigantic fir trees, bell towers, old steeples, the battlements of castles standing high above deep valleys, pinnacles of cathedrals, isolated peaks whose foundations rise out of frightful precipices. These are their chosen dwellings. It is on these heights that they build their nests. True Cenobites of the air, condemned like those of the Thebais to the most frugal and austere diet, they delight in solitude, and appear content just in proportion to the distance which separates them from man. There are also more graceful birds which dwell in the realms of ice and frost, and enliven the changeless and barren landscape. The greenfinch of the snow loves this cold country so much that it seldom descends to the wooded regions. The accentor of the Alps sometimes follows it to these great heights, but prefers the stony and sterile region which separates the zone of vegetation from that of perpetual snow. Others rise after them at times in pursuit of insects to the height of nearly 10,000 or 11,000 feet. The earth has its birds as well as the air, even at these heights. Certain kinds only use their wings for a few moments at a time, and when it is impossible for them to walk. Such are the gallinaceous tribe, and of these the snowy region has its own species, as it has its own sparrows. The lagopus, or snow hen, is found in Iceland as well as in Switzerland. This bird will rise into regions of perpetual ice and remain nestled at great altitudes. In winter its plumage takes the appearance of the frost in which it lives. The snow is so necessary to it that at the approach of summer it mounts higher in order to find it. It nestles and rolls itself in it with great delight. It digs holes in order to find shelter from the wind, the only inconvenience which it fears in its icy dwelling. Any pieces of lichen or grain brought up by the wind suffice for its nourishment, together with insects which it hunts for its young ones. Insects are, in fact, nearly the only creatures which multiply in these desolate regions, and in this respect they are like the polar countries. In the temperate zone, the coleoptera are to be seen in greater numbers, and in greater variety than in the neighboring regions of the equator. In the Arctic regions, during the short summer, the insects come out in great numbers, and in the high Alps it is the class of coleoptera which predominates. They reach to a height of more than 9,000 feet on the southern side, and to about 7,300 feet on the opposite side. These little creatures may be discovered in the holes, and they are almost always carnivorous, for at so great a height vegetable nourishment altogether fails. Their wings are so short that they appear to be completely destitute of them, so that they seem shielded by nature from the great currents of air which would infallibly carry them away if their wings were not, as it were, reefed in. Indeed, other kinds, such as the neuroptera and butterflies, are sometimes met with, but these have been carried by the wind to these heights, and they only perish in the snow. The néves and the ice fields are covered with victims who have thus perished. Yet there are certain species which brave the influence of the frost and are found even at the height of 12,000 or 15,000 feet. Mr. J. D. Hooker has observed butterflies on Mount Momay at a height of more than 16,000 feet. But, as mentioned above, they are only poor shipwrecked creatures whom the wind drives up in spite of themselves. The arachnidae, which in so many respects approach the class of insects, have also the privilege of being able to resist the cold of mountains. One almost microscopic insect of the Alps, the Daesoria glacialis, inhabits exclusively the neighborhood of glaciers. But really the melancholy of their abodes seems to be reflected in the appearance of these little animals. They no longer present the variety of tints which characterizes them elsewhere, and they are nearly all of a black or somber color, which at the first approach deceives you as to their existence in the holes which they inhabit. At these heights, the habits of insects are also modified according to the localities in which they live. M. P. Lioy, who has drawn up a philosophical sketch of the laws which organic nature obeys, and of which it is the ever-changing manifestation, remarks that the nocturnal insects of the plain become diurnal in mountainous places. That is, in fact, that the elevated regions reproduce, in some respects, the conditions of lower places during the night. They keep, even after the rising of the sun, the freshness and the shade which evening alone gives in the plains. Such is a picture of animal life in those alpine regions, where the fauna gradually becomes smaller and smaller until it at last gives place to solitude and desolation. Beyond the last stage of vegetation, beyond the extreme point to which insects and mammifers attain, all becomes silent and without inhabitant. Yet still the air is full of infusoria and of microscopic animalculae, which the wind raises like dust, and which are found in the air to an unknown height. So the animal kingdom does not disappear without having, so to speak, exhausted all the organizations compatible with the state of the soil as it becomes more and more chilled, and of the atmosphere which becomes more and more rarefied. Birds, like outposts of the great army of living beings, seem to defend the mountains against the invasion of death. The rapacious ones are in some sort the scouts, the passeres, the climbers, and some of the gallinae, answer to the main body of the army, and they love the intermediate region between the forests and the perpetual snows. The last firs, the last bushes, are like watchtowers from which they take observations on the weather, and hold themselves ready to descend if it be threatening, or to ascend whenever there is any lessening of the cold. In this middle region, the harmonious songs of the linnet and the nightingale have something doubtful about them, but the song of the mountain birds breathes joy and tells of the pleasures of living. Monsieur de Touchedy traces in a few lines a delicious picture of the existence of birds on the mountain. I translate freely. Rather before the sky is colored with the first morning tints, even before a light breath of air announces the approach of day, while the stars still sparkle in the firmament, the birds give the first signal of the awakening of nature. First, a light sound is heard from the fir trees, a kind of cooing in which the notes gradually become more distinct. It gets quicker by degrees and ends by swelling into a harmonious chorus, rising and falling from branch to branch as the bow of the musician passes from the gravest chords to those which are more acute. Then a more ringing noise sounds out all at once, and voices timid at first sing each their characteristic notes, each species making itself heard, and its own song more or less distinctly. The soft and melancholy nocturne has ceased, and now the winged people give the sun a serenade as he comes to warm up again their cold, damp dwellings. One would like to live a moment of this aerial existence in the intermediate belt of earth, with just sufficient vegetation to afford a shelter from the midday heats and from the midnight cold, just light enough for the eye to discern the magnificent panorama of mountains, and to gaze with delight into the firmament. But man is less favored in this respect than the birds. He is not organized as they are to rise in the air, and live in regions of very different atmospheric density. Happily, however, the difficulty which we feel in accomplishing a rapid and continuous ascent does not imply an absolute incompatibility of the higher regions with human life. We may become acclimatized to great heights. The town of Quito, situated at between 8,000 and 9,000 feet above the level of the sea, comprises a numerous population which does not appear to suffer from the elevation. Another town of the Andes, Potosi, is 12,300 feet high and contains more than 100,000 souls. After de Saussure had remained 15 days on the tops of the Alps, his pulse regained its normal motion, and Bousango, after a prolonged stay in the towns of the Andes, could easily bear the low temperature of the top of Chimborazo. But there are precautions to be taken if we would with impunity transport ourselves into these high situations, where, once established, and in suitable circumstances, it becomes possible to live. We should begin by habituating ourselves gradually to the barometrical changes of the atmosphere. A. Maury, Le Monde Alpestre, Revue des Deux Mondes. End of chapter 29. End of Mountain Adventures in the Various Countries of the World by John TIMBS.